Isabel Allende, The House of the Spirits, Part 3. People took Sunday outings to see the bird, souvenir vendors and strolling photographers made a fortune. Nonetheless, the public's interest quickly waned. But then Marcos announced that as soon as the weather cleared, he planned to take off in his bird and cross the mountain range. The news spread, making this the most talked about event of the year. The contraption lay with its stomach on terra firma, heavy and sluggish and looking more like a wounded duck than like one of those newfangled airplanes they were starting to produce in the United States. There was nothing in its appearance to suggest that it could move, much less take flight across the snowy peaks. Journalists and the curious flocked to see it. Marcos smiled his immutable smile before the avalanche of questions and posed for photographs without offering the least technical or scientific explanation of how he hoped to carry out his plan. People came from the provinces to see the sight. 40 years later, his great-nephew Nicolas, whom Marcos did not live to see, unearthed the desire to fly that had always existed in the men of his lineage. Nicholas was interested in doing it for commercial reasons, in a gigantic hot air sausage on which would be printed an advertisement for carbonated drinks. But then Marcos announced his plane trip. No one believed that his contraption could be put to any practical use. The appointed day dawned full of clouds, but so many people had turned out that Marcos did not want to disappoint them. He showed up punctually at the appointed spot and did not once look up at the sky, which was growing darker and darker with thick dark gray clouds. The astonished crowd filled all the nearby streets, perching on the rooftop and the balconies of the nearest houses and squeezing into the park. No political gathering managed to attract so many people until half a century later, when the first Marxist candidate attempted, through strictly democratic channels, to become president. Clara would remember this holiday as long as she lived. People dressed in their spring best, thereby getting a step ahead of the official opening of the season, the men in white linen suits and the ladies in the Italian straw hats that were all the rage that year. Groups of elementary school children paraded with their parents, clutching flowers for the hero. Marcos accepted their bouquets and joked that they might as well hold on to them and wait for him to crash so they could take them directly to his funeral. The bishop himself, accompanied by 2 incense bearers, appeared to bless the bird without having been asked, and the police band played happy, unpretentious music that pleased everyone. The police on horseback and carrying lances had trouble keeping the crowds far enough away from the center of the park, where Marcos waited, dressed in mechanic's overalls with huge racer goggles and an explorer's hat. He was also equipped with a compass, a telescope, and several strange maps that he had traced himself back on various theories of Leonardo da Vinci and on the polar knowledge of the Incas. Against all logic, on the second try, the bird lifted off without mishap, and with a certain elegance, accompanied by the creaking of its skeleton and the roar of its motor. It rose, flapping its wings, and disappeared into the clouds, to a send-off of applause, whistlings, handkerchiefs, drum rolls, and sprinkling of holy water. All that remained on earth were the comments of the amazed crowd below and a multitude of experts who attempted to provide a reasonable explanation of the miracle. Clara continued to stare at the sky long after her uncle had become invisible. She thought she saw him 10 minutes later, but it was only a migrating sparrow. After 3 days, the initial euphoria that had accompanied the first airplane flight in the country died down, and no one gave the episode another thought, except for Clara, who continued to peer at the horizon. After a week with no word from the flying uncle, people began to speculate that he had gone so high that he had disappeared into outer space, and the ignorant suggested he would reach the moon. With a mixture of sadness and relief, Severo decided that his brother-in-law and his machine must have fallen into some sort of hidden crevice of the Cordillera, where they would never be found. Rivera wept disconsolately and lit candles to San Antonio, patron of lost objects. Severo opposed the idea of having masses. Severo opposed the idea of having masses said because he did not believe in them as a way of getting into heaven, much less of returning to earth, and he maintained that masses and religious vows, like the selling of indulgences, images, and scapulars, were a dishonest business. Because of his attitude, Nivea and Nana had the children say the rosary behind their father's back for 9 days. Meanwhile, groups of volunteer explorers and mountain climbers tirelessly searched peaks and passes, combing every accessible stretch of land until they finally returned in triumph to hand the family the mortal remains of the deceased in a sealed black coffin. The intrepid traveler was laid to rest in a grandiose funeral. His death made him a hero, and his name was on the front page of all the papers for several days. The same multitude that had gathered to see him off the day he flew away and his bird paraded past his coffin. The entire family wept as befit the occasion, except for Clara, who continued to watch the sky with the patience of an astronomer. 1 week after he had been buried, Uncle Marcos, a bright smile playing behind his pirate's mustache, appeared in person in the doorway of Nivea and Severo de Valle's house. Thanks to the surreptitious prayers and the woman and children, as he himself admitted, he was live and well and in full possession of his faculties, including his sense of humor. Despite the noble lineage of his aerial maps, the flight had been a failure. He had lost his airplane and had to return on foot, but he had not broken any bones, and his adventurous spirit was intact. This confirmed the family's eternal devotion to San Antonio, but was not taken as a warning by future generations who also tried to fly, although by different means. Legally, however, Marcos was a corpse. Severo de Valle was obliged to use all his legal ingenuity to bring his brother-in-law back to life and the full rights of citizenship. When the coffin was pried open in the presence of the appropriate authorities, it was found to contain a bag of sand. The discovery ruined the reputation up till then tarnished of the volunteer explorers and the mountain climbers, who from that day on were considered little better than a pack of bandits. Marco's heroic resurrection made everyone forget about his barrel organ phase. Once again, he was a sought-after guest in all the city's saloons, and at least for a while, his name was cleared. Marcos stayed in his sister's house for several months. One night he left without saying goodbye, leaving behind his trunks, his books, his weapons, his boots, and all his belongings. Severo, and even Nivea herself, breathed a sigh of relief. His visit had gone on too long. But Clara was so upset that she spent a week walking in her sleep and sucking her thumb. The little girl, who was only 7 at the time, had learned to read from her uncle's storybooks, and been closer to him than any other member of the family because of her prophesizing powers. Marcos maintained that his niece's gift could be a source of income and a good opportunity for him to cultivate his own clairvoyance. He believed that all human beings possessed this ability, particularly his own family, and that if it did not function well, it was simply due to lack of training. He bought a crystal ball in the Persian bazaar, insisting that it had magic powers and was from the east, although it was later found to be a part of a buoy from a fishing boat, set it down on a background of black velvet, and announced that he could tell people's fortunes, cure the evil eye, and improve the quality of dreams, all for the modest sum of 5 centavos. His first customers were the maids from around the neighborhood. One of them had been accused of stealing because her employer had misplaced a valuable ring. The crystal ball revealed the exact location of the object in question. It had rolled beneath a wardrobe. The next day there was a line outside the front door of the house. There were coachmen, storekeepers, and milkmen. Later, a few municipal employees and distinguished ladies made a discreet appearance, slinking along the side walls of the house to keep from being recognized. The customers were received by Nana, who ushered them into the waiting room and collected their fees. This task kept her busy throughout the day and demanded so much of her time that the family began to complain that all there ever was for dinner was old string beans and jellied quiche. Marcos decorated the carriage house with some frayed curtains that had once belonged in the drawing room, but that neglect and age had turned to dusty rags. There he and Clara received the customers. The two diviners wore tunics, the color of the men of light, as Marcos called the color yellow. Nana had dyed them with saffron powder, boiling them in pots usually reserved for rice and pasta. In addition to his tunic, Marcos wore a turban around his head and an Egyptian amulet around his neck. He had grown a beard and let his hair grow long, and he was thinner than ever before. Marcos and Clara were utterly convincing, especially because the child had no need to look into the crystal ball to guess what her clients wanted to hear. She would whisper in her uncle Marcos's ear, and he in turn would transmit the message to the client, along with any improvisations of his own that he thought pertinent. Thus their fame spread, because all those who arrived sad and bedraggled at the consulting room left filled with hope. Unrequited lovers were told how to win over indifferent hearts, and the poor left with foolproof tips on how to place their money at the dog track. Business grew so prosperous that the waiting room was always packed with people, and Nana began to suffer dizzy spells from being on her feet so many hours a day. This time Severo had no need to intervene to put a stop to his brother-in-law's venture, for both Marcos and Clara, realizing that their unerring guesses could alter the fate of their clients, who always followed their advice to the letter, became frightened and decided that this job was for swindlers. They abandoned their carriage house oracle and split the profits, even though the only one who cared about the material side of things had been Nana. Of all of the Valle children, Clara was the one who, with the greatest interest in and stamina for her uncle's stories. She would repeat each and every one of them. She knew by heart words from several dialects of the Indians, was acquainted with their customs, and would describe the exact way in which they would pierce their lips and earlobes with wooden shafts, their initiation rites, the names of the most poisonous snakes, and the appropriate antidotes for each. Her uncle was so eloquent that the child would feel in her own skin the burning sting of a snake bite, see reptiles slide across the carpet between the legs of the jacaranda room divider, and hear the shrieks of macaws behind the drawing room drapes. She did not hesitate as she recalled Lope de Aguirre's search for El Dorado, or the unpronounceable names of the flora and fauna her extraordinary uncle had seen. She knew about the llamas who take salt tea with yak lard, and she could give detailed descriptions of the opulent women of Tahiti, the rice fields of China, or the white prairies of the north, where the eternal ice kills animals and men who lose their way, turning them to stone in seconds. Marcos had various travel journals in which he recorded his excursions and impressions, as well as a collection of maps and books of stories and fairy tales that he kept in the trunks he stored in the junk room at the far end of the third courtyard. From there they were hauled out to inhabit the dreams of his descendants, until they were mistakenly burned half a century later on an infamous Puri. Now Marcos had returned from his last journey in a coffin. He had died of a mysterious African plague that had turned him as yellow and wrinkled as a piece of parchment. When he realized he was ill, he set out for home with the hope that his sister's ministrations and Dr. Cuerva's knowledge would restore his health and youth, but he was unable to withstand the 60 days on ship and died at the latitude of Guayaquil, ravaged by fever and hallucinating about musky women and hidden treasure. The captain of the ship, an Englishman by the name of Longfellow, was about to throw him overboard wrapped in a flag, but Marcos, despite his savage appearance and his delirium, had made so many friends on board and seduced so many women that the passengers prevented him from doing so, and Longfellow was obliged to store the body side by side with the vegetables of the Chinese cook to preserve it from the heat and mosquitoes of the tropics until the ship's carpenter had time to improvise a coffin. At El Cayo, they obtained a more appropriate container, and several days later the captain, furious at all the troubles his passengers had caused the shipping company and himself personally, unloaded him without a backward glance, surprised that not a soul was there to receive the body or cover the expenses that had incurred. Later he learned that the post office in these latitudes was not as reliable as that of far-off England, and that all of his telegrams had vaporized en route. Fortunately for Longfellow, a customs lawyer who was a friend of the Del Valle family appeared and offered to take charge, placing Marco and all of his paraphernalia in a freight car, which he shipped to the capital, to the only known address of the deceased, his sister's house. This would have been one of the most painful moments in Clara's life if Barabas had not arrived among her uncle's things. Unaware of the commotion of the courtyard, she was led by instinct directly to the corner where the cage had been set down. In it was Barabas, or rather a pile of bones covered with a skin of indefinite color that was full of infected patches, with one eye sealed shut and the other crusted over, rigid as a corpse in his own excrement. Despite his appearance, the child had no trouble in identifying him. "A puppy!" she cried. The animal became her responsibility. She removed it from the cage, rocked it in its arms, and with a missionary care managed to get water down his parched, swollen throat. No one had bothered to feed him since Captain Longfellow, who, like most Englishmen, was kinder to animals than to people, had dropped him on the pier along with all the other baggage. While the dog had been on board with his dying master, the captain had fed him with his own hand and taken him up on deck, lavishing on him every attention that he had denied Marcos, but once on land he was treated as part of the baggage. Without any competition for the job, Clara became the creature's mother, and she soon revived him. A few days later, after the storm of the corpse's arrival had died down, and Uncle Marcos had been laid to rest, Severo noticed the hairy animal his daughter was holding in her arms. "What's that?" he asked. "Barabas," Clara replied. "Give him to the gardener so he can get rid of him. He might be contagious," Severo ordered, but Clara had adopted him. "He's mine, Papa. If you take him away, I'll stop breathing, and I promise you I'll die." The dog remained in the house. Soon afterward, he was running everywhere, devouring drape fringes, oriental rugs, and all the table legs. He rapidly recovered from his terrible condition and began to grow. After he had had a bath, he was found to be black, with a square head, long legs, and short hair. Nana suggested cutting off his tail to make him more refined, but Clara had a tantrum that degenerated into an asthma attack, and no one ever mentioned it again. Barabas kept his tail, which in time grew to be as long as a golf club, and developed a life all of its own that led to lamps and china being swept from tabletops. He was of unknown pedigree. He was nothing in common with the stray dogs in the street, much less with the thoroughbred racers that assorted families of the aristocracy were raising. The veterinarian was unable to pinpoint his origin, and Clara decided that he was from China because most of her uncle's baggage was from a distant land. The dog had a seemingly unlimited capacity for growth. Within 6 months, he was the size of a sheep, and at the end of the year, he was as big as a colt. In desperation, the family began to question whether he would ever stop growing, and whether he really was a dog. They suggested that he might be some exotic animal their uncle had caught in some remote corner of the world, and that perhaps in his natural habitat he was wild. Nivea looked at his crocodile claws and his sharp little teeth, and her heart leapt at the thought that if in one bite he could snap the head off any grown-up, it would be even easier for him to gobble up one of her children. But Barabas gave no indication of ferocity. On the contrary, he had all the captivating ways of a frolicsome kitten. He slept by Clara's side with his head on her feather pillow and a quilt up to his neck because he was very sensitive to cold, and later, when he was too big for the bed, he lay on the floor beside her, his horse's hoof resting on the child's hand. He never barked or growled. He was black and silent as a panther, liked ham and every known type of marmalade, and whenever there was company and the family forgot to lock him up, he would steal away into the dining room and slink around the table, removing with the greatest delicacy all his favorite dishes. And of course none of the diners dared to intervene. Despite his docility, Barabas inspired terror. Deliverymen fled precipitously whenever he struck his head onto the street, and once he caused a riot among the women who were lined up waiting to buy milk, startling the dray horse, who took off like a shot, scattering milk pills everywhere which way on the pavement. Severo had to pay for all the damage and order the dog tied up in the courtyard, but Clara had another fit, and the decision was indefinitely postponed. Popular imagination and ignorance with respect to his past lent Barabbas the most mythological characteristics. It was said that he would not stop growing, and that if a butcher's cruelty had not put an end to his existence, he would have reached the size of a camel. Some people believed him to be a cross between a dog and a mare, and expected him to sprout wings and horns and acquire the sulphuric breath of a dragon. Like the beasts, Rosa was embroidering on her endless tablecloth. Tired of picking up broken china and hearing rumors of how he turned into a wolf when there was a full moon, Nana applied the same method she had used with the parrot, but the overdose of cod liver oil did not kill the dog. It simply gave him a 4-day case of diarrhea that covered the house from top to bottom and that she herself had to clean. Those were difficult times. I was about 25 then, but I felt as if I had only a little life left ahead of me to build my future and attain the position I wanted. I worked like a beast, and the few times I sat down to rest, not by choice but forced by the tedium of Sunday afternoons, I felt as if I were losing precious moments of my life. Each idle minute meant another century away from Rosa. I lived in the mine, in a wooden shack with a zinc roof that I built myself with the help of a few peons. It was just one square room in which I had arranged all my belongings, with a crude window in each wall, so that by day the stifling air would have a chance to circulate, and with shutters to keep out the glacier wind that blew at night. My furniture consisted of a chair, a cot, a rough table, a typewriter, and a heavy safe I had hauled across the desert on a mule, in which I kept the miner's logbooks, a few papers, and a canvas pouch containing the few sparkling pieces of gold that were the only fruit of all my effort. It wasn't very pleasant, but I was used to discomfort. I had never taken a hot bath, and my childhood memories were of cold, loneliness, and a perpetually empty stomach. There I ate, slept, and wrote for 2 long years, with no greater distraction than a handful of books I read and reread, a stack of old magazines, some English grammars from which I pieced together the rudiments of that magnificent language, and a box with a key in which I kept my correspondences with Rosa. I had got into the habit of typing all my letters of her, keeping a copy of myself for myself that I filed along with the few letters I received from her. I ate the same food that was cooked for all the miners, and I had forbidden the drinking of alcoholic beverages within the mine. I kept none of my own house either, because I've always held that loneliness and boredom can lead a man to drink. It may have been the memory of my father, open-collared, his tie loosened and stained, his eyes clouded and his breath heavy, glass in hand, that made me a teetotaler, because I don't hold my liquor well. I get drunk in nothing flat. I discovered this at the age of 16, and I have never forgotten it. My grandmother asked me how I managed to live alone for so long, far removed from civilization. The truth is, I don't know, but it must have been easier for me than for most people, because I've never been particularly sociable. I have few friends, and I don't enjoy parties or festivities. I am much happier when I'm alone. At that time, I had never lived with a woman, so I could hardly miss something I hadn't grown accustomed to. I wasn't the type who's always falling in love. I have never been. I'm the faithful type, though. It's true that all it takes is the shadow of an arm, the curve of a waist, or the crease of a female knee to put ideas in my head, even now when I'm so old that I don't recognize myself when I look in the mirror. I look like a twisted tree. I'm not trying to justify the sins of my youth by saying that I couldn't control my instincts, nothing of the sort. But the point, I was used to having dead-end relationships with easy women, since there was no possibility of any other kind. In my generation, we used to distinguish between decent women and all the rest, and we always also divided up the decent ones into our own and others. I had never thought of love until I met Rosa, and romance struck me as dangerous and pointless. If a young girl caught my eye, I didn't dare approach her, since I was afraid of being rejected and ridiculed. I've always been very proud, and because of my pride, I've suffered more than most. More than half a century has passed, but I can still remember the exact moment when Rosa the Beautiful entered my life like a distracted angel who stole my soul as she went by. She was with her Nana and another child, probably one of her younger sisters. I think she was wearing a violet dress, but I'm not sure, because I have no eye for women's clothes, and because she was so beautiful that even if she had been wearing an ermine cape, all I would have noticed is her face. I don't generally spend my time thinking about women, but only a fool could have failed to spot that apparition who caused a stir whether she went and tied up traffic with her incredible green hair, which framed her face like a fantastic hat, her fairy tale manner, and her special way of moving as if she were flying. She crossed right in front of me without seeing me and floated into the pastry shop on the Plaza de Armas. Dumbstruck, I waited on the street while she bought licorice drops, which she selected one by one, with that tinkling laugh of hers, tossing some into her mouth and handing others to her sister. I wasn't the only one to stand there hypnotized, for within a few minutes a whole circle of men had formed, their noses pressed against the window. It was then that I reacted. It didn't cross my mind since I had no fortune, no one's idea of a proper young man, and faced a most uncertain failure, I was far from being the ideal suitor for that heavenly girl. I didn't even know her, but I was bewitched, and I decided then and there that she was the only woman in the world who was worthy to be my wife, and that if I couldn't have her, I would remain a bachelor. I followed her all the way home. I got to the same streetcar and took the seat behind her, unable to take my eyes off her perfect nape, her round neck, and her soft shoulders caressed by the green curls that had escaped from her coiffure. I didn't feel the motion of the car because I was in a dream. Suddenly she swept down the aisle, and as she passed me, her astonishing gold eyes rested for a moment on my own. Part of me must have died. I couldn't breathe, and my pulse dropped in its tracks. When I recovered my composure, I had to leap onto the sidewalk at the risk of breaking all my bones and run into the street into which I had already turned. Thanks to a cloud of violet disappearing behind a gate, I learned where she lived. From that day on, I stood guard outside her house, pacing up and down the street like an orphan dog, spying on her, slipping money to the gardener, engaging the maids in conversation, until I finally managed to speak to Nana, and she, God bless her, took pity on me and agreed to be our go-between, conveying my love letters, my flowers, and the innumerable boxes of licorice drops with which I tried to win Rose's affection.